If you loved The Invisible Man, but you haven't seen Hollow Man, you're the problem. What is up, everybody? Welcome to my review of 2000's Hollow Man. Something that I wanted to do this year that unfortunately I've just been too busy to actually implement is at least once a month I wanted to do a dedicated review to a film that I either find underappreciated or underseen altogether. And I just recently was a guest on the Not That Bad podcast. Please check them out. Subscribe over there where they go into Letterboxd, and any movie that's under 3.0 that they think is underappreciated, they talk about it and have a guest on.
Tell us a little bit about your history with this film and what kind of compelled you to pick it today.
It's always been one of my favorites. This is a movie that I saw in the theaters with my dad. So it came out in 2000, so I was 10 years old. It's a movie that I actually remember when the DVD came out. I was so excited to rewatch it that I actually set an alarm and got up early the next day before school so that I could watch the whole movie before I got ready.
Oh, wow.
And it's just continued to be one of those movies I don't hear too many people talk about. And I was a guest and chose Hollow Man because ever since I saw this in the theaters in 2000, I have always loved this movie. To the point where when The Invisible Man came out a couple of years ago, and that's also a fantastic version of this story, and everybody, critics, audiences, all together were talking about how amazing it was, and I kept asking, well, have you seen Hollow Man? Isn't Hollow Man awesome too? And the most common response was, what? And so here today, I'm going to try to rectify that. I'm going to give you all of the reasons why I think that this movie is awesome, try to generate a little bit of interest, and hopefully create some new Hollow Man fans out there. But really quick, before we dive into Hollow Man, just like the invisible nemesis of this film, identity theft is something that nobody sees coming either. So that is why we are partnering with Aura on today's video. As time goes on and technology advances, more and bigger pieces of our lives are tied to online accounts and social media presences. And while we all love the speed and convenience of that, it also opens you up to the threats of cybersecurity and identity theft, which is a huge growing concern in society. In fact, identity theft is the fastest growing crime in America, with a new victim every 14 seconds. And that's why I'm excited to partner with Aura, which is an easy to use app that has every single tool that you will need to stay safe while surfing online. With Aura, you'll have identity theft protection, fraud monitoring, VPN, password management, and antivirus software. And with Aura, you'll also get near real-time notifications of credit inquiries, as if somebody is trying to open a credit card or a loan using your name. And while I'm sure most of you watching have one or two of those already, if you do not have all of them in your arsenal, it's like locking the front door and leaving the back door wide open. In fact, the day that I activated my Aura account, I got over 50 notifications of my email address showing up on the dark web. That's a section of the internet where hackers and cyber criminals trade and sell your personal information. So let Aura do the heavy lifting to keep you safe online by using my exclusive link and getting a 14-day free trial. And you will be shocked at how much of your personal information they keep safe just in those 14 days. So go to aura.com/Cody Leach or use this QR code to start your trial of Aura today. And thank you, Aura, for sponsoring today's video. So Hollow Man is a science fiction horror film that came out in the year 2000. It stars Kevin Bacon, Elizabeth Shue, also had Josh Brolin, kind of when he was still getting a bit of a resurgence in his career, was not quite the A-lister that was Thanos and in a whole bunch of Oscar-nominated roles and films quite yet. And it was also directed by Paul Verhoeven. And if that name sounds familiar, it fucking should, because this is the director of RoboCop, the director of Total Recall, Basic Instinct, can't forget Starship Troopers. That's another favorite on there. He's one of the more prolific directors, especially of the 80s. And this is one of his lowest rated and least valued films. And for the life of me, I don't know why, but I'm going to get into all of that. It's a star-studded cast. It's a really intriguing, modern, at the time, remake of The Invisible Man story. And to me, it dives into a lot of things that were done very well in the most recent Invisible Man, and some things I actually prefer the way that they were dove into in Hollow Man. So starting off with the positives for Hollow Man, the main thing that I was impressed by when I rewatched it this morning is how well the special effects have held up. And this is the most special effects driven iteration of this story. It really dives into the science fiction side of things, to where you have Kevin Bacon, the main character, Sebastian Cain. He is the leader of a group of scientists that have been hired by the military to develop a formula to turn people invisible and then also develop a formula to return them to being visible. And the movie kicks off with them trying to figure out how to get that reversion side of things back. They've been getting animals to turn invisible left and right. They just can't get the motherfuckers back into the visible world. And so immediately when you get the first sequence where they are testing out this new formula and you see the special effects that this movie is going for, to where you have an invisible ape, and after they give her the formula, the veins and the arteries and the muscular tissue and the tendons and the skeletal system and everything slowly starts to come back into vision. It was so awesome to see in 2000, and I think it holds up damn well. This is a fantastic example of 2000 CGI, and there ain't many of them. Even more so when eventually Kevin Bacon goes under for the procedure himself, and you go from full-on Kevin Bacon as his skin slowly starts to deteriorate, you go through the muscular system and the skeletal system and the tendons and the circulatory system, just one by one starting to kind of deconstruct the human body. That is an awesome effect. The way that they utilize the invisible effect that he is in for the rest of the film, especially in the third act when things go full on slasher film and they're using smoke and heat signature and even blood at one point to try to pinpoint where he is, and the way that they utilize that effect. There's a really badass scene in a swimming pool where invisible Kevin Bacon inside of the swimming pool, and it looks awesome, holds up well, and to me, it's the standout feature of this iteration of the story. And being that this is Paul Verhoeven, a man that loves his blood and gore, even the gore effects in this movie are pretty effective to me. They're all pretty much relegated to the last 20 minutes or so of the film, but there is some pretty bloody shit that happens. There is some very painful ways that some of these people die. There's an awesome scene that's not necessarily, blood gushing out of somebody's body, but one of the characters paints the floor with these little blood bags so that if he steps, she can see it. And eventually, like I said, throwing blood onto him, and just the look of Kevin Bacon in that scene is so villainous and so evil and creepy that I think they use the science fiction side as well as the horror side of special effects to its fullest potential from back in 2000 especially. Moving on from that, I really like the way that this film kind of explores that whole notion that is one of the most intriguing questions to explore in a story for me. And most recently this year, Infinity Pool was a film that explored it really in an interesting way. Which is, do we have an inherent moral compass? Do people have a desire to do good and to do the moral thing? Or is it simply just the rules and the laws of society that keep us in check? If you no longer had the fear of consequence, if you no longer had the fear of being caught and having to take on the consequences of your actions, would that unlock some dark part of your persona? Would that bring out your worst tendencies? Is it our moral obligation to our fellow man that keeps us in check, or is it just the desire not to want to be punished? And if you take away those parameters, what would that do to a human being?
It's amazing what you can do when you don't have to look at yourself in the mirror anymore.
Now, that is a theme that is explored in pretty much every iteration of the Invisible Man story, but it's probably to its darkest degree explored in this with the character of Sebastian Cain. Because right off of the bat, you're introduced to this guy, and even though because Kevin Bacon is a naturally charismatic actor, you have a bit of a likability factor there, at least I do. But from the beginning, you get very clear indication that this guy has a superiority complex. He's got a bit of a God complex. He thinks that he's above everybody. He thinks he's smarter than everybody. And slowly throughout the movie, especially after he turns invisible, you start to see all of his worst traits just get amplified.
Well, if you weren't so short-sighted, you'd be out there with the rest of us trying to save your goddamn life.
My life. I have no fucking life. I'm a prisoner.
He's driven entirely by his own desires, by his own wants. He gives complete disregard for everybody else's safety, everybody else's reputation and jobs and their feelings. There's something that I'll dive into in the mixed category where he has a serious streak with sexual abuse, and at its mildest is just like a man using his power for inappropriate gain, and at its worst is a full-on rapist. And so all of these really sick and twisted things come out about this character that they kind of give you the smallest inklings of whenever he is not invisible, and give you enough explanation as to why those things are kept in check. But as soon as those parameters are off and he feels like he can do what he wants without consequence, all of those darker forms of his personality come out in full force. And not only do I think that that makes for a really interesting main character and eventual villain, is a character that you kind of hate to love at first and then you love to hate by the not even halfway point of this film, and just exploring that theme in a really interesting, unforgiving, and brutal way that, is pure Verhoeven style. He does not really pull a whole lot of punches, he goes for it. If we're killing people, it's going to be bloody and painful. If we're having sex scenes, it's going to be gratuitous. If we're exploring certain things, we're going to explore the shit out of it. And it's a really interesting choice to have the villain of the movie be the main character, be the one that you are following throughout most of the first two acts, the one that has most of the focus in the story and the screen time, and then by the end of it, he's an absolute monster, and suddenly you are absolutely rooting for him to get his. There's not many movies that can do that bold of a switch and pull it off. And part of the reason why that works is not just because Kevin Bacon's an awesome actor, but you also have a great supporting cast. Like I said, Elizabeth Shue and, of course, Josh Brolin are kind of like the other somewhat co-leads that certainly turn into the leads by the third act of the film. They are both great. You have a supporting cast of all the minor characters, all the other scientists and veterinarians and technicians that they work with that, despite the fact you don't get to know a ton about them, and none of them really get a serious focus, they get like a good line or a good scene, you feel like you'll learn just enough about them to where they're satisfying characters and they're entertaining. It's very similar to like John Carpenter's The Thing, to where some characters definitely stand out, get a lot more character work, get a lot more focus, but the other ones that are just kind of there and get distinct personality types and even caricatures to a degree, you still feel like they're an entertaining piece of the puzzle. And specifically with the relationship between Kevin Bacon and Elizabeth Shue's characters, I actually think that the movie does a really nice job at exploring kind of a feminine and masculine role in its most diabolical form without being heavy-handed, without being a movie that's going to be message first, story and characters second. I mean, you essentially have this character that is the worst form of toxic male that you could possibly think of, preying on every single woman pretty much that works with him, using his power not only of authority but also eventually of invisibility to unbelievably disgusting ways, and then eventually letting his jealousy and his, perceived rejection by Elizabeth Shue and her relationship with Josh Brolin to really be like the catalyst for his complete unhingement in the third act and for the slasher side of this film. And I enjoyed that as he has that descent, you really keep Elizabeth Shue in the primary protagonist role where she is the one who eventually has to take him down. She is the one that eventually has to show him that he's not God. She is the one that eventually has to make him face all the consequences of what he is doing. And they could have very easily have shared that between her and Josh Brolin. They could have very easily have shifted it over to Josh Brolin. It becomes ex-boyfriend versus current boyfriend for the entire third act. But while Josh Brolin has a significant role in the third act, it's Elizabeth Shue versus Kevin Bacon. And so while the movie doesn't beat you over the head or put it on a gigantic banner, and they never advertise the movie as being this type of scenario, by the end of it, it's absolutely about a woman kind of rising up against the aggressive man. And so when you have a message like that that is valid and certainly has a really sick and twisted exploration of the way that they do it in this film, and you're able to stick the landing without feeling like you're shouting at me through a megaphone, that's another huge plus.
You think you're God? I'll show you God!
It's to the point where the most recent Invisible Man is actually quite a bit more overt with that message. And I love that movie. I think it does it tremendously as well. But this is one of those weird scenarios to where Paul Verhoeven was more restrained and subtle with the exploration of what he's trying to do. And I also love the way that this movie is structured with the three acts. The first act is all about science fiction. It's all about this invisibility formula and the revisibility formula and showcasing the special effects and trying to establish the government program that Kevin Bacon and Elizabeth Shue and all the other characters are working within, and diving more into the scientific specifics of how this is all going to work, and giving some intriguing little details in there about how it actually would be to be invisible, with the eyelids being transparent, and he goes to vomit at one point in the second act and his bodily fluids are also invisible. You get into the second act and it's full-on thriller. You have Kevin Bacon starting to abuse that power little by little. You have him starting to unhinge and snap and start to go out and explore the dark powers of invisibility out in the real world. And then eventually in the third act, it's full-on horror slasher film. And while some people might watch this film and feel like it's disjointed and feel like it doesn't necessarily have a consistent tone, and I guess I could understand that if it's, presented to me in a certain way, but I actually like the fact that this movie kind of keeps you guessing and constantly changes direction and changes pace, and I think that they pull it off well, and it makes it a very rewatchable movie because you're not just watching one thing for 2 hours, you're actually watching like 3 very different genres.
Let him go! Let him fucking go!
I also really enjoy the score to this movie. Jerry Goldsmith does the music for it, and it's got a really eerie tone to it that matches all 3 of the acts here, to where at first it's that very scientific intrigue, science fiction kind of vibe, and then that same exact score gets ramped up just a little bit more in the second act, which adds to some of that tension, adds to some of that thriller aspect, and when this does eventually turn into a full-on horror film, I think those same musical notes, those same sections actually work well in that segment as well. So this is one of those films where it's not a score anybody's probably ever talked about since 2000, but I really dig it. I like the way that it complements everything that they're trying to do with the story. And my final positive, and I will explore some aspects of this in my mixed, is that I appreciate the fact that this movie gives no fucks. This movie is bold. This movie does all of the taboo things pretty much that you have certain people say, if you do this, I am no longer watching your movie, or if you do this, I have been turned off, or I can't watch it, or just, it's my bugaboo. If you have that happen in a movie, you have lost me. And Paul Verhoeven was like, okay, let me collect all of those and do all of them in one movie. And while that certainly limits the audience a bit, and maybe that is something that attributes to some of this movie's low ratings and some of its low reviews, especially upon release, and not being a movie that's as well regarded as the most recent Invisible Man, but for those that it does work for those of us that can watch this and appreciate it for its boldness, I like the fact that it's one of those old school movies that has balls that you absolutely would not be able to make today. Now moving on to the mixed. Now this does not affect my experience, but just to be completely transparent, because it is something that is going to limit the amount of people that are going to be interested in this and entertained by this, because of what I just said, there are certain things that this movie explores that will turn off or will fail to entertain certain people. Number one is that there is quite a bit of violence against animals in this. And I know with slasher films, there's usually a couple of rules, like if this happens, that's not a movie for me. And, killing a dog, that is almost always number one on people's list for whatever reason. And I love dogs too, so I kind of get it. There is animal cruelty in the sense of them testing on animals. They've got dogs, cats, gorillas, all types of different species in here. There is a dog that gets killed about 2/3 of the way through the movie in a pretty violent way. And there's also a detail in the film that never seems to get expressed or talked about, probably because the movie itself doesn't really get talked about that much, but when I watched it this most recent time, it dawned on me and I was like, oh my God, that's kind of fucked up. So when Kevin Bacon goes under and he actually becomes invisible, very quickly, within like the first 5 minutes of this happening, he freaks out and covers his head with a blanket because the lights are on, and they realize, oh, because his eyelids are transparent, he is unable to blink his eyes. And so you think about the sensation of your eyeballs if you weren't allowed to blink and lights are on. Even if there is no lights on, just like, holy shit, my fucking eyes are they're on fire right now. They never realized that, or at least never addressed it in any way for all of the animals that they have now turned invisible. So you have these like gorillas that are just getting pissed off and getting like primal and beating their fists against the walls and biting people. Well, yeah, motherfucker, because they can't sleep. It was actually kind of a sick hilarity to it when that dawned on me this time. I always thought it was a cool detail, and I still do, but the fact that they never addressed that about the animals, there's like, oh shit, yeah, Kevin Bacon, of course, yeah, let me help you out with a mask, or we'll turn the lights down or whatever, and the animals, they're like, fuck you, lights are on, 100%. all day long. The second one is that there is a pretty aggressive sexual abuse and sexual assault tone to this movie from start to finish. I mean, it starts off mild to where he is still intact as a person. He's not invisible, and Kevin Bacon just has this looming nature, especially in regards to Elizabeth Shue, who is his ex-girlfriend, who he knows clearly is in a new relationship. Doesn't know who she's in a relationship with. That comes out in the third act, and he loses his fucking shit about it. But he makes it very uncomfortable. Like, he's always kind of looming around her. He's always touching her. He's always kind of getting close and, you know, suggesting certain things. Immediately, whenever he turns invisible, the first thing that he does is grab the titty of the veterinarian that he does not like so much on his team. He sticks his hand up the skirt of Elizabeth Shue. He forces a kiss on her. He looms over her a couple of different times past that. There's a full-on rape in the movie. I mean, it's pretty aggressive. That's one of his main villainous traits, is that abuse of power. He feels like he can do whatever he wants, take whatever woman that he wants. And so if you're somebody that's sensitive to that, you're probably not going to enjoy this movie whatsoever. And I'm somebody that I actually am sensitive to that sometimes. I don't like watching things like Last House on the Left or I Spit on Your Grave, where to me, most times, more times than not, actually, unfortunately, is that those sexual assault scenes are really gratuitous. And aside from just making you despise the villains, it never really seems to have an effective enough point for me to justify it happening. I understand that there is stories that need to be told about the revenge and everything like that, I guess, but it's just not the type of movie for me. As many times that they have recycled that formula, it's not a movie for me because it just never really feels like that has much of a purpose. In this movie, I feel like it does have a purpose because it is one of the main traits of what they are exploring with the villain in regards to that whole moral compass versus the laws and the rules of society thing that I was talking about. And it's one of the most overt negative traits, villainous traits of Kevin Bacon's character. And so it's not like he's just this murderous guy that suddenly is able to kill people, which would be a pretty cool movie too. But it's somebody that it's the most disgusting display. It's the most disgusting example of abuse of power. And so I think that despite the fact that it is very aggressive and it's prevalent throughout the entire movie, I think that it does have a purpose, and I think that they use it effectively. And it's to the point where one of the few times Paul Verhoeven has kind of limited himself a bit, I don't feel that it is overly gratuitous. And had it been, I would be saying something very differently. There is a director's cut that kind of lingers on that stuff a little bit longer, especially that scene in the third act with Rona Mitra. But the theatrical cut, especially, I feel like it shows you just enough to know what's happening without getting gratuitous. So all in all, guys, know who you are walking into this. You know, the things that I said in my mix, if that's going to be a big issue for you, probably not something that you need to check out. But if you have never seen this movie, if you've never heard anybody talk about it, and especially if you love the most recent The Invisible Man, check this thing out. It's on HBO Max right now, both the regular and director's cuts. And let me know what you think. You might like it as much, you might like it even more. And I really do think this is one of those underappreciated movies from that weird transition phase from the 90s to 2000s that needs some more attention. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed this, please click over here for a playlist of my 2023 new release reviews. I'm also going to put my review of The Invisible Man up here. So please like and share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss videos in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.